A rich kid slapped the wrong person's son. A high school director covered up the assault. The consequence? 800 of the most feared bikers in 3 states, the Iron Vultures MC, silently surrounded the school. This is what happens when you hit a child whose father's loyalty was bought years ago with a single small act of kindness. They came to make one thing clear: the biker's son is untouchable. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Elias Eli Finch was a 15-year-old boy, all wire-thin frame and oversized glasses, navigating the labyrinthine halls of Crestwood High with a constant, heartbreaking vulnerability. He possessed a gentle soul and an intellect far surpassing his peers, qualities that should have earned him respect but instead marked him as prey in the small, rigid town of Oak Harbor, Ohio. His solitary existence was not by choice, but a painful birthright. His father, Thomas Reaper Finch, was the president of the infamous Iron Vultures Motorcycle Club. This single damning fact preceded Eli everywhere, a shadow of judgment that tainted every interaction. He desperately tried to be a normal student, burying himself in books and art, the only elements of his life he could control, refusing to let the town's prejudice steal his inherent quiet goodness. Eli lived perpetually on the frayed edges of accepted society, his poverty masked by a desperate cleanliness, his loneliness a cloak he wore every day. His suffering was the constant low-grade hum of social exclusion, the quiet cruelty of a community that had already convicted him based on his father's reputation. He carried the heavy burden of his father's club, an invisible weight of debt and defiance that manifested as palpable anxiety in his young life. His world was one of gray industrial skies and chipped paint, a stark contrast to the manicured lawns and relentless cheerfulness of his classmates' lives. The environment of Oak Harbor, a forgotten stretch of the American Rust Belt, felt designed to highlight Eli's desolation. The town had once thrived, but now only its judgments remained strong, holding fast to the belief that the Finch name was synonymous with trouble. Eli understood the Iron Vultures clubhouse, a sprawling metal hangar on the industrial outskirts, was his only true sanctuary, yet he could never bring that world into the bright, judgmental glare of the high school. His constant struggle was a silent battle for legitimacy, a desperate hope that his excellent grades and quiet demeanor would finally outweigh the heavy leather and loud engines that defined his heritage in the town's eyes. His mother's death years prior had solidified his isolation, leaving him and Reaper bound together by an unbreakable but profoundly solitary grief. Eli was a boy who felt the world's unfairness with a sharp, almost physical pain, yet he never retaliated, never sought to prove his worth through aggression. This was his purest vulnerability. He was a lamb among wolves, refusing to adopt their tactics, choosing instead the excruciating difficulty of maintaining his moral integrity. He spent his afternoons drawing intricate sketches of silent highways and colossal protective machines, a visualization of the escape and safety he rarely felt in the real world. The atmosphere of Crestwood High was steeped in the sickly sweet scent of hypocrisy, where rules were only enforced against those without power. Eli frequently sought out the meager comfort of the library, a vast, echoing space that offered a temporary, silent escape from the constant low-level bullying and the dismissive stares of the faculty. He was acutely aware that the system, the school, the local police, the community itself, had written him off. To them, he was a ticking time bomb, the inevitable result of a bad element, a conclusion that made him feel permanently transparent and utterly defenseless against the inevitable wave of false oppression he knew was coming. His purity was a refusal to confirm the stereotype. He was not a troublemaker, but a scholar, a gentle spirit determined to find beauty and order in a world that insisted on chaos and judgment. This kindness was often mistaken for weakness, an open invitation for others to test his boundaries. The other students, driven by their parents' whispered warnings, treated him like a ghost, a pariah to be avoided at all costs, ensuring his seat at the lunch table was always the loneliest one in the room. He was utterly alone against the crushing invisible forces of classism and inherited prejudice, but he never let the bitterness take root in his kind heart. Eli was a living contradiction, the son of the most feared man in 3 counties, yet completely devoid of malice. He saw the world in shades of fairness and unfairness, an absolute moral clarity that his adult peers had long surrendered. The pain he carried was the loneliness of the morally upright in a corrupt landscape, a gentle warrior who refused to lift his sword. He continued to hope, foolishly, beautifully, that if he just remained good enough, the forces of oppression would eventually tire and leave him be. A fragile, impossible wish that the intrusive narrator knew was about to be violently shattered. The profound and central bond between Elias and his father, Thomas Reaper Finch, was not a conventional one, but a fierce, almost mythic loyalty forged in the aftermath of tragedy. Reaper was a colossus of a man, his frame permanently curved by years of riding and the heavy weight of his club's responsibilities, his arms and neck covered in the dark ink of service and sacrifice. The society of Oak Harbor saw only the menacing exterior, the heavy leather cut, the formidable size, the deeply set eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much war and too little peace. To the world, he was the personification of disruption, the figure of dread that parents warned their children about. But to Eli, he was simply the exhausted, deeply loving man who occasionally smelled of motor oil and cigar smoke. The Iron Vultures themselves were viewed as an unholy confluence of ex-cons, combat veterans, and societal rejects, feared precisely because they operated outside the town's flimsy social contract. They ran on a strict internal code of honor, a medieval sense of loyalty that superseded civil law. This was the terrifying image the town held, and it was the source of Eli's profound isolation, the heavy price he paid for his father's chosen path. Yet, within this feared brotherhood, there existed a surprising, almost religious reverence for absolute loyalty, and Eli's well-being was the highest, most sacred article of their unwritten constitution. The foundational act of kindness that initiated the debt of honor, the moment that secured Eli's invulnerability, had occurred 5 years before this narrative's climax. Reaper, recently widowed and overwhelmed by grief and a crumbling business, had hit a rock bottom that few men ever truly survive. He was slumped in the shadowy recesses of the Vultures clubhouse, a man absolutely defeated, having lost his wife and facing the imminent loss of his livelihood. The formidable armor of the club president had momentarily cracked, revealing the devastating vulnerability beneath, a quiet moment of absolute emotional surrender that no one, especially not his son, was meant to witness. 10-year-old Eli, who understood sacrifice and quiet suffering far too well, approached his father's broken figure. He carried with him his total savings, the culmination of birthday money and meticulous chore earnings, a crumpled $20 bill, and a small, worn leather care kit. It was a meager offering in monetary terms, but a king's ransom in sincerity, representing the boy's entire accumulated wealth, given without hesitation or any thought of reward. Reaper looked down at the offering, the small leather tin nestled in his enormous calloused palm, the $20 a tiny green speck against his tattooed skin, and the impact was immediate and annihilating to his emotional walls. "A king needs his armor, Dad," Eli had whispered, his young voice trembling slightly but firm in its intention. "You need to stay dry no matter how bad the storm gets. I saved this for your coat." The gesture was pure, instinctive, and selfless, a child's total sacrifice for his protector's dignity. It was the devastating honesty of this moment, the absolute absence of self-interest, that shattered Reaper's emotional defenses. He had faced down death, stared into the void of the world's cynicism, but he was completely undone by the simple, unconditional love of his gentle son. Reaper, a man who believed the world was a place of endless betrayal, looked into Eli's eyes and saw the crystalline, undeniable proof that genuine, uncorrupted goodness still existed. He realized then that Eli was the only truly clean thing left in his life, a beacon of pure light in the endless moral twilight he inhabited. The simple, small $20 bill was not a gift. It was the sacred, inaugural investment in a lifetime of unwavering protection. From that moment on, Reaper lived under a single, non-negotiable directive. Nothing and no one would ever be allowed to inflict pain or injustice upon his son again, regardless of the cost or the collateral damage. This single act of kindness, this tiny, quiet sacrifice, transformed the Iron Vulture's fierce loyalty from a mere club code into a matter of cosmic personal honor. The debt was not financial, it was moral, a profound commitment to safeguard the most vulnerable and pure being they knew. Reaper had been judged and condemned by society 1,000 times over, but in his son's eyes, he was still the king who needed his armor. That day, the club's president swore an internal, silent oath that Eli's safety would be the collective's ultimate mission, a debt so enormous that only an equally massive and definitive act of retribution could ever settle it. The Iron Vultures were feared, but their fear was about to be weaponized in defense of the boy whose pure heart had redeemed their leader. The Iron Vultures, often misunderstood as mere thugs, were in reality a profoundly structured organization, a brotherhood united by shared experiences of societal abandonment and veteran status. They were a family of the damned, and Eli Eli's small, kind act had made him their unofficial, most precious ward. His purity became the moral compass for men who had lost theirs long ago. The memory of that 10-year-old boy handing over his final $20 was the quiet engine of the devastating, collective action that was about to descend upon the hypocritical, judgmental landscape of Oak Harbor. This terrifying, beautiful alliance was the direct result of a child's love. The insidious campaign of injustice against Eli reached its devastating, unavoidable crescendo within the confines of the Crestwood High cafeteria, a place that should have offered safety, but instead became a stage for his public execution. Todd "Tank" Harrison, a physical brute fueled by entitlement and a deep-seated contempt for intellectual humility, had his fragile ego shattered earlier that day when Eli, with his characteristic quiet brilliance, corrected one of Tank's grossly inaccurate historical presentations. Tank, the privileged son of a powerful local real estate developer, interpreted Eli's intelligence not as scholarship, but as a deliberate act of profound social treason that demanded immediate, physical retribution, believing the son of a biker club president was the safest possible target. The confrontation was sickening in its calculated cruelty, an act of pure social domination designed to crush Eli's spirit. Tank cornered the smaller boy, a hulking monument of muscle and rage, and with a swift, malicious motion, batted Eli's glasses off his face, sending them skittering across the slick cafeteria floor. The ultimate blow, however, was the open-handed slap that followed, a loud, brutal crack that silenced the surrounding noise and left an immediate, undeniable, purple-red stain on Eli's cheek. Eli, though shaking and tearful from the humiliation and pain, adhered to his deep moral code, refusing to lash out, absorbing the assault with a heartbreaking, dignified silence that was mistakenly read as total capitulation. In the aftermath of the assault, his face throbbing with the physical evidence of the attack, Eli did the only thing the system had taught him to do. He sought the intervention of authority. He reported the incident to the administrative staff, his voice small but firm, laying bare the truth of the aggression and the sheer terror he felt. He placed his final, desperate trust in the system, believing that the school's written policies against violence and the fundamental principle of justice would, at long last, rise to protect him from the sheer brutality of his tormentor. He truly believed the adult world was obligated to act. Director Sterling, however, the very embodiment of bureaucratic corruption and self-interest, met Eli's desperate plea with a rehearsed, sickening apathy. Sterling's true allegiance lay not with the vulnerable student, but with the massive financial contributions and political influence wielded by Tank Harrison's father, a figure essential to the school's budget and the community's social structure. The director saw Eli's bruised face not as evidence of a criminal act, but as a deeply inconvenient political crisis that threatened the smooth operation of his self-serving tenure. His fear of the Harrison name far outweighed his moral obligation to any child. The failure of the system was immediate, absolute, and profoundly demoralizing. Sterling minimized the vicious assault with a practiced, cynical ease, dismissing the entire incident as a typical misunderstanding between teenage boys. He issued Tank Harrison nothing more than a limp, meaningless verbal warning, a disciplinary wrist slap that was a pure declaration of institutional favoritism. Crucially, the director then pivoted the blame, suggesting with a condescending tone that Eli should consider if his overly sensitive nature or his tendency to provoke the other students might have contributed to the unfortunate outcome. This official deflection of responsibility was the core trauma, the ultimate injustice that stripped Eli of his last vestige of hope. The school, the very institution mandated to be his protector, had officially sanctioned the violence, signaling to Tank and the rest of the student body that the son of the biker was fair game and that the rules simply did not apply to the wealthy. Sterling concluded the meeting by dismissing Eli with a polite but frigid finality, stating that the matter was closed and that the school's hands were effectively tied by a lack of substantial evidence, a lie delivered with a professional smile that cut deeper than any slap. The moral vacuum that resulted from this institutional betrayal was enormous and absolute, paving the way for the terrifying, necessary intervention. Eli left the director's office with a crushing sense of total desolation, realizing with devastating clarity that the very structures meant to provide safety were complicit in his oppression. His innate goodness and adherence to the rules had been been rewarded with abandonment. The system had failed him completely, leaving a wide-open void where justice should have been, a vacuum that was about to be filled by the deafening, seismic arrival of a much older, much less forgiving code of honor. Eli walked the streets of Oak Harbor that afternoon utterly alone, carrying the physical mark of Tank's violence and the far heavier psychological burden of the system's treachery. The injustice was now absolute, a moral outrage that cried out for a response outside the confines of law and bureaucracy, a response that the town was wholly unprepared to witness. He was utterly vulnerable, a child abandoned by every legitimate avenue of protection, and the stage was set for the only form of justice that could now apply, the overwhelming, uncompromising, and deeply cinematic retribution of the Brotherhood. The stage was finally prepared for the Iron Vultures to pay their long-standing sacred debt in full. The news of the school's cowardly verdict and the physical evidence of the injustice reached Thomas Reaper Finch like a bolt of white-hot, focused energy. He was hundreds of miles away, addressing an organizational meeting, when a secured video feed showed him the undeniable, heartbreaking purple mark blooming on Eli's cheek, the image of the handprint on his son's face, a silent, undeniable testament to violence and systemic failure, was the absolute tipping point, a cataclysmic violation of the sacred private vow he had made years ago. The pure rage that filled him was not loud or explosive. It was cold, precise, and utterly terrifying in its controlled intensity, the deep, lethal calm of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. Reaper ended the connection with a quiet click, his face a granite mask of contained fury, and immediately initiated the highest-level call of the Iron Vulture's internal network. His voice, when he spoke to his vice president, was a low, dangerous rumble that cut through the silence of the room. "It's time for the flood, Ghost," he commanded, using the ancient non-negotiable code for total, instantaneous mobilization. "I want every full-patch member, every allied chapter, every brother and sister who owes the Vultures a debt, ready to roll before the first light hits the horizon. This isn't a battle, and it's not a brawl. This is education. Tell them to wear their community service vests and their shiniest chrome. Oak Harbor needs a demonstration of morality, and we are delivering the lecture." The flood command cascaded through the states, instantly overriding all personal obligations and prior arrangements. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a collective activation driven by the strict, inflexible code of loyalty that bound the Iron Vultures and their allies. Throughout the deep, silent hours of the night, the American highway system became a vast, secret assembly line, funneling dark, powerful machines and their formidable riders toward the single unsuspecting target of Crestwood High School. It was an organization of the dispossessed answering a moral alarm, motivated by a debt of honor that superseded all other concerns. As the sun began its ascent over the oblivious, self-righteous town of Oak Harbor, the air itself began to vibrate with a low, growing frequency that was primal and deeply unnerving. The distant sound grew from a hum to a roar, a seismic rolling thunder that announced the arrival of an inevitable mythic justice. It was a mechanical, unstoppable storm. Not 10, not 100, but over 800 colossal Harley-Davidson and Indian engines. A massive dark river of polished steel and black leather that consumed the residential streets leading to the high school, shaking the very foundations of the quiet suburb. The sheer scale of the arrival was hyper-real, a visual and sonic assault designed to instill absolute paralyzing dread in the hypocritical community. The colossal assembly of bikers, men and women of imposing stature with faces etched by hard living and harder choices, parked with military precision, the ranks stretching for blocks. Neighbors and the few early arriving parents watched from behind net curtains, their faces pale with fear, convinced that the town was about to be engulfed in uncontrollable chaos. They saw an army of menace, a collective nightmare come to life, and the terror that settled over Oak Harbor was immediate and absolute, the price of years of unearned judgment finally being demanded. Director Sterling, arriving to face a day he assumed would be merely inconvenient, stopped dead in his tracks, staring out at the ocean of black leather and chrome that now completely surrounded his school. Reaper, a towering figure of controlled fury, led a small delegation toward the entrance, but the main body of the immense group remained parked, silent, and entirely stationary. They were a massive, living fence, an impenetrable wall of armed protection, and they were not there to breach the school's defenses. They were there to establish a sacred perimeter around the one person the school had failed. The ultimate inversion of expectation occurred as the town watched, terrified and confused. The collective threat was not an attack on the institution, but a silent, overwhelming declaration of support. The vast, intimidating presence of 800 heavily patched bikers was revealed as a magnificent, terrifyingly efficient shield designed to protect a single, small, vulnerable boy. The true power was in the restraint, the stillness of the massive force, a promise of destruction that remained unspoken, yet palpable, ensuring that every soul in Oak Harbor understood the immense moral error they had committed in abandoning Elias Finch. If you believe power shouldn't protect predators, and that the little guy deserves absolute, unwavering protection, smash that like button right now. Your engagement is the proof that people care more about raw, undeniable justice than they care about politics or social standing. This immense silent assembly was the true embodiment of justice, a massive, unmoving boundary between the forces of systemic corruption and the small, quiet heart of the boy they were sworn to protect. The silence of the 800 bikers was louder than any engine roar, delivering the message that Eli was untouchable, guarded by an army of unlikely leather-clad angels. The final act of justice, delivered by the Iron Vultures, was not achieved through physical violence, but through a cold, absolute weaponization of competence and scale. While the colossal force of 800 bikers stood guard, their silent, overwhelming presence paralyzing the entire town, Reaper and his small specialized delegation, the retired federal prosecutor, and the certified public accountant, marched into Director Sterling's office. The atmosphere inside was thick with the director's fear, a man utterly annihilated by the sheer spectacle unfolding outside his window, a man who realized his petty institutional power was nothing against the unified moral force that had descended upon his town. The lawyer calmly and meticulously laid out a comprehensive legal strategy, including evidence of every ignored bullying complaint, every reported financial irregularity regarding the Harrison family's donations, and the clear violation of school policy in the handling of Eli's assault. The Vultures had not come for a fight. They had come for a complete, clean institutional dismantling. Under the direct, unblinking gaze of Reaper and the crushing implicit threat of the silent army outside, a clear promise of massive public exposure and a relentless legal battle, Director Sterling completely, pathetically collapsed. His position, built on cowardice and political maneuvering, dissolved instantly. The result was an immediate, stunning, and thoroughly cathartic resolution. Director Sterling was compelled to sign his immediate, unconditional resignation, effectively removing the cancerous moral failure from the institution. Simultaneously, Tank Harrison received an indefinite official suspension, and the school initiated disciplinary measures that guaranteed the bully's permanent departure from Crestwood High. Tank's influential father, attempting to intervene, was met at the entrance by a dense, unmoving phalanx of silent bikers whose stares were colder than steel, his bluster evaporating into the cold Ohio air as he realized his local power was utterly impotent against this collective, determined force. The true emotional climax arrived when Eli was escorted from the building, no longer a victim seeking help, but a young king being presented to his loyal guard. He stepped outside and into the absolute silence of the crowd, his eyes widening at the unbelievable, awe-inspiring sight of the hundreds of intimidating figures standing in his defense. Reaper, his voice thick with pride and deep affection, stood before his son and performed the ultimate sacred rite of adoption. He removed a brand new small-cut leather vest, perfectly sized for Eli, and gently draped it over his shoulders, the pristine, smaller Iron Vulture's patch proclaiming his status to the world. "This is your shield, son," Reaper announced to the collective silence of the crowd and the terrified community watching. "You are not just a Finch, you are Vulture, you are family, you are protected by every single person and every single mile represented here." Eli, overwhelmed, clutched the vest, the tears that fell now being tears of profound relief and unconditional belonging. The overwhelming sense of isolation was violently stripped away, replaced by the warmth of 800 loyal hearts, a collective, permanent promise of safety that no amount of money or political maneuvering could ever breach. The judgmental community, watching the scene from their windows and cars, was forced to swallow a massive bitter pill of their own prejudice. The very people they had labeled as criminals and societal detritus had just delivered a purer, more definitive act of justice than their entire established system could ever produce. The moral of the town was forcibly corrected by an army of the excluded. With their mission unequivocally accomplished and the debt paid in full, the Iron Vultures began their powerful, unified departure. The immense roar of 800 engines starting simultaneously was a final, earth-shaking pronouncement of a promise kept, a righteous, rolling thunder that shook the foundations of Oak Harbor's hypocrisy. They left behind not destruction, but a peace built on an absolute, unshakable foundation of loyalty. The true courage, the narrator concludes, is not the absence of fear, but the ability of a child to remain purely good in the face of absolute betrayal, and the willingness of a brotherhood to become an overwhelming, unstoppable army in defense of that vulnerable goodness. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that heroes exist in every form, that loyalty is the highest virtue, and that sometimes the only way to find true justice is to look outside the system.